Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is on the topic of how we can think about climate change impacts in forested watersheds, and what can we do about it. And so in just a few minutes that I have with you today, I'll start talking about some big climate change impacts that we're thinking about, and then give you some ideas on how some land managers actually in Massachusetts are actively responding to climate change impacts and getting ahead of it before it becomes a really big problem. So before I go any further, my name is Danielle Shannon. I work for the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. I also I wear many hats. So I'm a Michigan Tech University employee. I'm located way up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, north of Wisconsin, way up there. And I also am in charge of the coordinating activities for the Northern Forest Climate Hub, which is a USDA effort. So this is the group that I work with. Maybe some of you have heard of us or have met some people from my group. We're also called NIACs. And Maria Genoviak is probably a person that you've heard of or you've met. All of us at NIACs, be it in the climate adaptation sphere or in the carbon management, we're a pretty large group. We focus very specifically on trying to synthesize climate change information and carbon information, and prepare information that helps land managers and people who care about the land better understand climate change. So we create practical information and adaptation resources, and then also provide technical assistance like this. Our group is funded through several different entities, but we're largely a multi-institutional partnership among federal, NGO, academic organizations, and even forest industry and tribal groups as well. So, just putting a finer point on this idea that we know that thinking about climate change and natural resources can be really complex. And so our job is to help all of you get the information that you need and really try to create things that are practical. So that is the focus of our work, is to work with land managers to help coach them into applying that climate lens. So starting to better see what those potential challenges could be before they become a huge problem, and to help them and customize approaches for adaptation that make sense for the place that they live in. We also recognize that adaptation actions are really unique, and that's because they're based on the place that you care about. So what makes sense for a land manager in northern Missouri might not make sense for your area in Massachusetts. And so we've worked really hard to broaden our scope of topics so that they include not only resources for forests or even urban forests, but also include that watershed context, resources to support tribal communities and other managers who are working with tribal communities. We have wildlife resources for the management of wetlands, and even for forest carbon management. So today I'm not going to talk about any of those in great detail, but if you're interested in learning about those, I'd be more than happy to share some information with you. So this is a little bit of a roadmap of where we're going in this talk. I'm going to talk really briefly about climate change and some of the observations and projections, really briefly and coarsely, dip into talking about adaptation, and then share a real-world demonstration project as well. So first and foremost, why do we care about forests and wetlands? Well, as all of you are totally aware, forests are one of the best land uses for achieving high water quality. They are natural filters to mitigate erosion and reduce storm flows, capture and store water, regulate our stream flows, and provide a whole host of other environmental services in addition to cultural and spiritual benefits, right? Like, not only are forests helping us in every other way with clean air, but they're also wonderful places to visit. And I think all of us are on the same page for our great understanding and care for forests and wetlands. And some of you are thinking about not only caring about those lands, but maybe you're thinking about specific ways that you can maintain those forests into the future. And so we might have ideas of management activities that can help to reduce risks to water quality so we can maintain good water quality, maybe actions that would help us sustain water quantity. I know water quantity is a really, may not be a big deal sometimes in the Northeast. It's too much water at times. But overall, watersheds are providing resources for the community, so water quantity is an issue. But there's a whole host of considerations that we have when we're thinking about the management of watersheds. And when we think about climate change, it really becomes an added consideration to these existing management concerns and objectives that we have in our watershed. Now, I think, your side of the country, in comparison to any one of the other 20 states that we work in, I think is most really living through some real climate changes. You've experienced some very large changes in precipitation patterns in recent years. This is an image that's showing the increases in annual precipitation of anywhere from, well, it's hard for me to read it exactly, but I'm guessing 5 to 15% increases in annual precipitation in comparison of the last half of the century to the first half. And we know these numbers are only increasing annually, but also in some seasons more than others. The storms that we're receiving are different than they were in the first half of the century. They're bigger. These numbers I have are actually for the Midwest, but they're 55% bigger. And according to this image, 92% more frequent with those more intense, longer period events. So, what we're seeing and what we're feeling outside in nature, in addition to warming temperatures, is, this huge change in precipitation patterns as well. And so really briefly, when we're looking at some of the information that we have, looking into the future for end of century or maybe by mid-century, there's a huge consensus that the climate will continue to change. That those changes will precipitate in a variety of different ways. And, depending on our global carbon emissions, that could take us in several different. But overall, the expectation in all scenarios is that seasonal precipitation pattern is going to change. It's going to continue to become more frequent and even more intense than it already is, with more rain. That will have huge impacts on winter snow melt and the timing and melt rate and even retention of that snow throughout the year, and is likely to then have consequences in its timing, where flooding is likely to increase, and especially in areas when you have that phenological mismatch, and the snowpack is warmer at a time of year when the trees can't help to take it up. Increasing temperatures is for sure going to happen into the future at a rate or a final amount where we are unknowing, but we do know that more hot days are in our future with fewer cold nights. Winters will become milder, longer heat waves, longer growing season, and more demand on water resources in our watershed as the vapor pressure increases. I don't know why it says decreases. So it's drier air and more evaporation. But these are big statements, and so I would love it if you would dig into these a little bit more on your own so you can get comfortable with looking into the future and looking at that range of plausible futures. So I would recommend starting with the National Climate Assessment to better understand this topic a bit more. But we do know that with changes in precipitation and even just moderate increases in temperature, we're very likely to see, intensification of some issues that we're already dealing with related to infrastructure or erosion, water quality issues, and increased runoff, leading to maybe some increases in nutrient and harmful algal blooms in our water. And just due to changing land uses, and the temperature changes, we're likely to see some water supply changes as well. But what does that mean for forests? Ta-da! That's the real niche that my group works in, is thinking about how is a changing climate going to affect our forests across the Midwest and the Northeast. Lucky for you, we have recently written a vulnerability assessment for New England, and it's a really cool resource. It's about 200 pages. Don't worry. It's not that hard to read. It is written in plain language, but it gives you all of the observed climate changes, the future climate changes, and a real clear assessment of forest vulnerability and how tree species might respond to those changes. Really broadly, we're seeing that forests are likely to change in response to these climate changes, not only due to changing precipitation patterns, but the changes in seasons. And, more or less different stressors and drivers are likely to push some of those changes, such as pests or even fire. So here's a look at how those forests might change, with a bunch of species that are projected to maybe not fare as well given those changing conditions, such as black ash due to emerald ash borer and also its own tolerances, eastern hemlock, balsam fir. But there's a huge list of potential winners as well, and that's shown in green. So definitely go to our website that I have listed on the bottom of the page here to learn more about what those species are that are in your watershed and maybe some potential vulnerabilities as well. One thing to point out is that although I am saying that the species are likely to decline, it is still very unclear how some of these species will be able to expand from southerly areas, and we certainly are not knowing of the rate of decline for the species that might be intolerant to changes in temperature, pathogens. But we do know that over time, even a very resilient forest is likely to face increasing challenges as chronic disturbances come in, more frequent droughts, and more persistent changes in precipitation patterns, increased pests and diseases. So it's really these interactions over time that can stress our forests and change them sometimes in a slow manner over several years. But is your watershed going to just change completely? It's hard to say because every site has a different adaptive capacity, and that's due to its hydrologic sensitivity to change. How well can your watershed retain water? What is the source of its water? Is it surface water? Is it groundwater? How quickly can it recharge? What type of vegetation lives there, and what is the tolerance of that vegetation? These are questions that can change the outlook that's predicted. And are there other stressors that is going to push that momentum of that forest into a different direction? So when you look at these climate projections, even the ones that are the climate projections and not the forest projections, it's really important to think about your area and the things that you know about your area that can shift that balance one way or the other. So let's walk through an example of how, maybe one aspect of the watershed change can have other changes in the watershed. So if we're to take hemlock woolly adelgid, we know that this is a problem in your area and it's going to continue to be a problem. Well, it is just a problem for hemlock, right? Well, as hemlock woolly adelgid continues to take over the forest, we're likely to see much larger increases in dieback. And those issues are likely to translate into the stream, changing the conifer canopy cover, and can have huge impacts on the water quality, the flood control ability of that watershed, and even the nutrient uptake as well. So it's not just a single tree problem, it really is a watershed problem. Looking at this in more detail, we know that hemlock is in the upper part of the watershed. These are very important species for our riparian areas. These are our sponges. And so if we lose those areas, what will happen how will that change the hydrology of our watershed? Well, it's very likely to change that water retention and maybe allow more water to flow at a greater volume and at a higher, a more rapid pace downstream. And that's likely to have maybe some greater challenges for the downstream community or even how that receiving stream and river can handle that water flow. The impacts of the loss of storage is, very simply more energy directed downstream. So again, if we take a look at that watershed view, we know that, sure, we might have a problem, a highly vulnerable area in one part of our watershed, but just like water that flows, down. So changes in local conditions don't always have those local impacts. So just like as water flows, the impacts associated to climate change are also going to flow downstream and exacerbate some of the existing problems, maybe related to aging infrastructure, and really overwhelming those in certain instances. So maybe in the past, for a riparian area that was intact, a small storm event might not have had a huge effect downstream. But once that key area is lost, it can really overwhelm those downstream systems. So this is the type of thinking that I hope all of you will start to apply that climate lens to when you start thinking about the vulnerabilities in your watershed. So it's all well and fine to know that maybe some parts of your watershed are vulnerable, but what can you do about it? And at our organization, we really focus on this idea of adaptation. And adaptation is really simply responding to these climate change impacts in a way that is in line with your values and is also in line with how much risk you can tolerate. Some communities can tolerate more risk than others, and that's a value judgment that you'll have to make for the lands that you care about. One thing we like to point out is that, many of us are doing good forest management, and we're making wise decisions already in our forest management. And it's not to say that after you consider climate change that those decisions won't still be a good decision, but it's taking that step to take a pause and think about the lands that you care for now and the actions you're taking, and then thinking about climate change will help us know if those actions are going to work out, and will really provide us that basis of intentionally taking action. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail right now, but we do work with land managers, especially professional land managers, to articulate these climate considerations and conceptualize what adaptation looks like by using some resources that we've created. And these adaptation resources are simply to help all of you connect those, the goals of what you're trying to do to your climate change impacts, in order to then help you respond in a really intentional way with clear adaptation actions. So, we do work in workshops or, consulting or coaching. Our work is free, and you can find a lot of our resources and examples of our work at forestadaptation.org. One thing in the last minute or two before I jump to the example, I just want to take a pause and say, well, how do you take action? And as you're looking at your watershed, there's a couple of big ideas that might help you strategically define where to take action. And that could be based on prioritization, based on the most vulnerable areas of your watershed, and maybe the likelihood that your actions will reduce that vulnerability. It's highly likely that you could do that. I would say always look for no regrets decisions and those win-win opportunities that not only help you respond and prepare for climate change, but also are in line with other ecosystem services ideas like, helping the fish. So can you look at a water crossing and think about helping that fish habitat, but while also thinking about climate change? There's a no regret opportunity there. And finally, taking precautionary actions whenever we can, just to get out in front of those risks might make sense now rather than waiting for it to become a really big problem. Okay, so last minute, let's look at a demonstration project just north of you, I believe, on the edge of Massachusetts and Vermont. So this is an H.O. Cook State Forest, and it's a project. It's a partnership between the Franklin Land Trust, Trout Unlimited, and Massachusetts DCR. And they're really focused on work within the North River watershed, but chose to work at H.O. Cook for this project. Their whole objective was to prepare for the system change, just get out in front of these problems, but also to find some win-win opportunities where they had already had some culvert failing and some issues they knew they needed to deal with. As they started thinking about climate change, they were finding that their area was prone to experiencing extreme events, more frequent extreme events now and projected into the future. Their streams were incredibly flashy and high energy, high velocity flows. And they thought a lot of that those events were also causing, problems for their aging infrastructure and increasing erosion. They also located some hemlock. Their main goals were to protect the trout and create better fish habitat. And so they were recognizing that their key riparian species, the hemlock, was very likely to decline due to hemlock woolly adelgid being found just off site. So that was going to very likely lead to warmer stream temperatures. And in addition to the loss of snowpack that they were experiencing and was projected to be an effect on that land, they knew they needed to act. So the actions that they decided to take was to really address the fish passage issues and to make improvements that were those win-win opportunities. So they not only chose infrastructure that was good for the fish, but they also sized it so it was larger for higher and lower stream flows and helped to increase that habitat connectivity across all of their streams. They chose to plant in-stream large wood to help deflect that fast-moving, high-velocity stream flow and hopefully slow erosion, but obviously also to help improve habitat. They, through using the in-stream wood, they wanted to enhance their pool to riffle ratio, and they were hoping if they had deeper pools, maybe that would provide habitat in droughtier times. And then finally, they're preparing for the loss of their key riparian species, hemlock, and thinking about what to underplant underneath it before the invasives can come in and make it a really big problem. So in conclusion, I would love to work with you guys to help you in a real world management situation. I can work with you to create a custom adaptation plan. We can do it several different ways, and I'll be in touch so we can talk about that more later. But I would really like it if you would check out our story map. So this goes into more detail of how New England and Northern New York forests what those climate challenges are into the future. It's a really nice way to look at our vulnerability assessment. So in closing, climate change presents a lot of uncertainty because we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but we can't let that stop us from taking action. We really need to address it now before it becomes a much bigger problem for these lands. The job that we're doing is really the same. I mean, the goals that we have for the land is going to continue, but these stressors that we face and the challenges we face are going to change. And I think you're experiencing that now with invasive species management. So, also we would like if you would adapt based on the values and your risk tolerance, but most importantly, document how you're going to do that and what your considerations are for not only the benefit of your watershed, but also so that people who come in after you know what it is that you're trying to do. And I will leave it at that.